Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. And this week, the concept is corporate inversions, and the application is lower taxation or increased taxation, depending on how the U.S. government wants it to go. With me are my co-hosts, Remy Canario, a political analyst from Washington, D.C., and Rick Samuelson, a venture capitalist out of the West Coast. Hey guys, good to see you.
Hi, Chris.
So let's get started here on corporate inversions. Let's pull something up from the Wall Street Journal, an article written by Richard Rubin on April 5th. And it says the U.S. U.S. Treasury Department issued new rules late Monday against corporate inversions, transactions in which U.S. companies take a foreign address, often through a merger with a small firm. What's the government trying to do? The U.S. Treasury Department wants to make it harder for companies to make the arithmetic on inversions add up for companies. The government also wants to reduce the post-inversion maneuvers companies can use to lower their U.S. taxes. And Treasury officials are trying to do that within their own authority, given the congressional stalemate on the issue. How do they do that? First, they go after what they call serial inverters, companies that have engaged in multiple inversion transactions. The rules would disregard 3 years of past mergers with U.S. corporations in determining the size of the foreign company. By subtracting the value of the U.S. assets a foreign company had acquired, the foreign company would become smaller in relation to the U.S. company. Why does that size matter? After a merger, if the shareholders of the former U.S. company own at least 80% of the combined firm, the government treats the new combined business as subject to U.S. taxes, basically negating the inversion, even if its address is abroad. If they own at least 60%, some restrictions apply, but the company is still considered foreign. That's led companies to keep their inversions below 60% and prompted the government to propose rules halting various techniques for doing so. Okay, who loses? First off, are Pfizer Incorporated and Allergan. The companies are planning the largest inversion ever, well, they were planning it, which would put Pfizer's tax address in Ireland. Because Allergan is itself a product of several U.S. inversions, the company's carefully calibrated plan to put the ownership percentage at 50%, 56% would be obliterated. And it was, because Pfizer did walk away from this. What else is the Treasury doing? The government issued regulations against what's known as earnings stripping, a kind of transaction that typically occurs after an inversion. Companies can lend money from their foreign headquarters to what is now the U.S. subsidiary in a transaction that has no effect on the consolidated company's books. But it matters for tax purposes because the U.S. Treasury gets interest deductions against the world-high 35% U.S. corporate tax rate, effectively pushing income to a country with a lower tax rate. The rules would give the government more authority to treat those debt transactions as equity movements under the tax code. Well, I'm going to skip this paragraph. Why don't companies want to have their headquarters in the U.S.? The headquarters where executives work often doesn't move after an inversion because of the benefits of the U.S. workforce and legal protection. But other countries have much more favorable tax systems. That's because they don't tax their companies' worldwide earnings and because they have lower marginal tax rates. Inversions offer companies the best of both worlds: access to U.S. market, customers, and workers without all of the burdens of the U.S. tax code. Okay, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew keeps saying Congress needs to act because the administration's authority is limited. So how are they doing this? That's a question that may ultimately get resolved by the courts. The regulations cite the government's ability to issue anti-abuse regulations that explain and police the tax code. Will the government's actions get challenged? Well, maybe. A company that proceeds with an inversion or intercompany debt and then gets taxed can take the government to court and challenge the regulations. Resolving such a case could take years, and the risk involved for the companies gives Treasury an advantage. Well, also, Congress is not doing much either. Democrats want to lower the 80% threshold to 50%, which would prevent any U.S. company from inverting by buying a smaller company. Republicans would rather wait for a broader revamp of the tax code that would lower the corporate tax rate and the taxes on U.S. companies' foreign earnings. Okay, so let's examine this. Let's summarize this and examine this just a tad more and its implications and meanings. First of all, we've got these companies wanting to do an inversion, and the corporate merges with a smaller foreign company. Okay, we know that from the article. U.S. companies take foreign incorporation headquarters, and essentially what they're doing is they're re-domiciling it and placing the virtual headquarters, in this case I believe it was Ireland, which has a tax benefit, reducing the ultimate tax benefit down from 35% to 15%. The executives stay back in wherever they are here in the U.S. But this method of inversion has now caught the eye of the U.S. Treasury and the administration in particular, and so they have decided to jump in and make some difficulties for these companies because they don't like it politically. So the U.S. Treasury writes a bunch of regulations, and as we just saw from this article, it now becomes too difficult for the companies to take advantage of this lower tax rate. So the companies stop inversion. They stop doing their inversions, and they do so because of the U.S. Treasury decides they shouldn't do it, just by writing some rules. Well, this brings up a kind of a small matter called Article 1, Section 7 of the U.S. Constitution, where it says all bills for revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. But the Senate may concur and add amendments as it does for other bills. So, but it doesn't say anything about the Department of Treasury. So, what happened? Well, really, the ultimate culprit here is Congress itself. Congress passes these bills on policy and routinely says then that the executive branch may make any and all necessary regulations to effectuate Congress's policies. And the inversions is a good example. They take laws and The government has the ability to issue, in this case, anti-abuse regulations that exploit the executive branch has ability to police the tax regulations, and so they take that authority and they write whatever regulations they want to be able to effectuate whatever result they want to get. In this case, companies dropping inversions. So it's really total carte blanche. Congress really has done this routinely, and creating all departments, and all these departments are then say, well, it's up to them to write the regulations and police what's happening in that marketplace. And so let's just take a quick look at the list of agencies that Congress has created. You got agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services, homeland security, house and urban development, interior, justice, Department of Labor, State Department, Department of Transportation, the Treasury Department, Department of Veterans Affairs. There's no place in the economy where Congress has not gone and then let the executive branch write all the regulations and do whatever they want. It's really carte blanche. So I really think that there really is no need. The conclusion is that there's no need for Congress anymore. They're just giving away all their power and to the executive branch. And so I would like to call for the abolition of Congress, because they don't want their power. They just sit around and have hearings, look in front of TV cameras, collect a paycheck, but they're not doing anything because they're really sloughing off their job and just letting the executive branch do it. And so I think Congress ought to resign. So what do you guys think? What do you think of these corporate inversions? Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first. When we talk about corporate inversions and how to prevent them in this country, the conversation often focuses on the relatively high corporate tax rate that we have in this country. Granted, 35% is the official tax rate. The actual effective tax rate for most companies is around 19%, which is much more in line with global standards. But even if that weren't the case, I seriously question whether lowering the tax rate in and of itself to, say, the 19% that they're actually paying right now, and making sure that that's enforced, would necessarily be such a blow against the incentives to have a corporate tax inversion. First off, because even if the tax rate is 19%, is that really enough to stop a company from wanting to go to Ireland, where the effective tax rate would be 12.5 or even 6.5%, depending on the activities involved within Ireland? But more importantly, it seems to me that the bigger incentive is not the tax rate itself, but rather the fact that all American-based companies are subject to American income taxes on all of their global income. Now, Ireland and almost certainly every other country where these corporate inversions are headed do not have that feature, and that is what seems to me to be the major motivating factor. So if we were to address this problem, that, I believe, would have to be at the center of what we were talking about, and I haven't seen that conversation happen yet. In addition, if we are going to lower the corporate tax rate in an effort to stem these kinds of inversions, that would be the carrot, but there would have to be some kind of a stick so that it isn't just a race to the bottom, and where we inevitably end up having to match the lowest tax rates across the planet.
Rick?
Well, I'm not sure having the lowest tax rates across the planet would be the worst of all worlds. I mean, the problem Rummy speaks of also extends to individual taxpayers, and I've experienced myself where you're taxed on worldwide income, and therefore you end up paying taxes, even if you live in a foreign country, to the United States on your personal income, none of which is generated in the United States. And I repeat, none of which is generated in the United States. I lived for years in Japan and other parts of Asia and paid millions of dollars in taxes to the United States, even though none, absolutely none of the income was generated there. In fact, I paid more taxes to the United States than I paid by a multiple to the Japanese and the Korean governments. That's the way it works. So there's an injustice, from that perspective, that the United States government is quite glad to take advantage of. But getting back to the tax inversion issue, it's true the effective rate is lower because of various deductions that apply to various industries, and the range in effective rate that companies actually pay can vary quite significantly depending on the industry and so forth. So I still think that tax reform is at the heart of how this has to be addressed. Not all companies in all sectors are doing these tax inversions. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective in probably most industries. In a few, like pharmaceuticals, it does because of the deductions allowed there in part. So I still would say the United States, if it wants to be competitive from a tax perspective in a competitive world, needs to look at its tax code. It's long overdue for being simplified, and I think that's acknowledged on both sides of the aisle, frankly. And the fact that this was never taken up in the current administration is a blot on both the administration and Congress.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you on that one. This seems as though this is something that we should be able to figure out. It's not something that anyone's happy about, and it is a bit of a sign of the times that we haven't been able to proceed with this. I do think that the stumbling block has been making these changes revenue neutral. The question is, if you rationalize the tax code, which you should do, in many ways, that will lead to a current law bringing in less revenue. So I don't see why it shouldn't be impossible to find a revenue neutral solution that undoes these distorted incentives. And Richard, I just want to say that I completely agree with you about the injustice of taxing American citizens when they generate their income abroad. But I'm not sure that it's an accurate parallel to say that it's the same kind of injustice for a company, because an individual living overseas derives no benefit from the services that the government provides, whereas a corporation that's global with a large U.S. presence does benefit from, and so it deserves to be taxed for the benefit they derive.
well, it is being only taxed on the international earnings. The higher taxation is of course the problem here is that the American system taxes these companies globally as opposed, so they just want to get their global profits lowered as opposed to their, it'd probably be nice to get their domestic profits also lowered. And of course that brings up two questions. We've both, everybody's talked here about tax reform and lower taxation, and really to bring even a tax reform back into the United States and lowering corporate taxation here would have the greater benefit of producing a more corporate profits, which would translate into what I believe a direct translation into more jobs, increasing the profitability of corporations. They reinvest, they give greater dividends. Dividends are taxed, and more jobs are created through the research and development that they can bring money to. And it also has a secondary benefit of inviting international investments into the United States, because as the article pointed out in the Wall Street Journal, international markets like the U.S. labor pool, and they like the property rights and the rule of law here, so that they know that when they invest here, no one's going to take it away from them. So I think all those advantages it's just a win-win for tax reform. What do you think of those? What do you think, guys?
Well, the wonder is that, given how obvious it is, that neither the administration nor the Congress wants to embrace it. I mean, there was a proposal in the very early days of the administration to do just this and address tax reform across the board. And it was sort of bandied around for a couple of years, and recommendations were made, and neither Congress nor the administration wanted to touch it.
So why is Treasury doing this? Just suddenly coming out and just throwing a monkey wrench into the whole thing. It's effectively raising the corporate tax structure of the United States and sidestepping Congress. And why? I mean, if everybody's here in agreement, why would they do such a thing?
Well, in this case, I think that we all agree that the status quo is undesirable, but that doesn't mean that actions can't be taken during the status quo to prevent the worst kinds of abuses and the actions that would be most harmful to the U.S. economy. I mean, clearly losing $130 billion company's headquarters is a major loss to the United States. So I do see this as something that is being done to protect the U.S. taxpayers in the meantime until we can fix this. But Chris,
but they're not losing their headquarters. It's just being re-domiciled outside the United States for tax purposes. The actual headquarters is going to remain.
Lost tax revenue. I mean, right there. It's and if it doesn't come.
Well, they're not losing it. They never had it.
Excuse me?
Never mind. Go ahead.
No, I do question the direct relationship between corporate profits and employment. We have seen years and years of record profits with minimal job growth, and this especially seems to be the case with the vanguard of technology, with social media. Even companies like Apple, they simply do not employ as many people as big companies used to. So these companies are sitting on massive amounts of money, using them for acquisitions, using them for share buybacks, using them for dividends. And if it were the case that record profits lead to record job creation, the numbers would have been very different, I think, than they have been. That being said, I do think that this is something that we all seem to agree on, and what is incumbent upon us all is to think of creative solutions to stop this problem while still bringing in the revenue that this country needs, given our debt, given the fact that there are services the government has to provide that are necessary. A few episodes back, I suggested that the corporate income tax be lowered or even abolished, and in large part replaced with a carbon tax. It's going to bring in the same amount of revenue and yet create an incentive for something positive to happen, if nothing else than helping us be world leaders in green technology. You put a price on something, people consume it less, and in this case, that would spur American innovation that's going to be driving the economies of the future.
Okay. Rick?
Well, I hesitate to blame the corporations outright. And corporations owe it to their shareholders to minimize taxes, and that's a corporate obligation. So they deal with the tax rules in place at the current time in order to make their tax situation as efficient as possible. And so it comes back. It's not a moral issue. It's an issue of practicality. And I come back to the need for tax reform. And since the Erskine-Bowles recommendations of years ago, at the beginning of this administration, and this is long overdue and needs to be addressed on a broader basis than just dealing with the inversions. There's a much broader issue concerning overall tax reform, because it's a bit like sticking a finger in a dike, right? You fix one little regulation here or there, and then other leaks spring up. Unless you do it on a holistic basis, that's what you're going to find, because the corporations hire expensive lawyers and they find ways around the current regulations.
Well, guys, I think we all agree in that tax reform is, and certainly corporate tax reform is needed, and I think we all need, it needs to be generated, needs to go downward so that we can be more competitive internationally. I think we all agree on that. And so let's leave it there, and we'll see everybody next week on another episode of the Philosophical Angle. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.